Thank you for listening to Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandan Das. We're continuing to discuss the Bhagavat Purana, or Srimad Bhagavatam, the beautiful Bhagavatam, which is the crest jewel, or the cream of the cream of the Vedic literature. It discusses the avatars of Vishnu in great detail. And sages have absorbed in this literature for thousands of years, absorbing their consciousness and purifying themselves at these wonderful stories. And so Sukadeva Goswami, the primary teacher of the Srimad Bhagavatam, has arrived in an assembly of sages on the banks of a holy river in Delhi, or what was then Hastinapur. And the great king, Maharaja Pariksit, a great devotee of God, is there on the bank of the river fasting unto death. And he's fasting unto death due to a curse by a young Brahmin boy, that within 7 days a snake bird, takshaka, sort of like a dragon or celestial serpent, will come and bite him. And the venom of this dragon is so strong that he'll immediately burst into flames. And so he's there recognizing that death is coming. And he's becoming detached from the world and entering completely into spiritual consciousness. And in the assembly of great sages that sort of arrive from the forest spontaneously to hear the speaking of Srimad Bhagavatam, also enters the great sage Sukadeva Goswami. And during this time also, Pariksit, he hands his kingdom over to his eldest son, Janamejaya. And when he does this great act of detachment, then immediately the drums can be heard playing in the sky. So like the gods are playing drums in the sky, and they begin showering flowers upon the king. This is something you typically find within the Vedic literature. When the gods are very pleased with you or they're celebrating your actions, flower petals will just start raining from the sky, and celestial sounds, horns and drums and things like that will start playing. That basically the gods are beating drums and celebrating, the glories of this wonderful individual. And so that's what they're doing with Pariksit. So he hands over the kingdom and he prepares to fast until death and to absorb himself in the katha, or the spiritual topics of the incarnations of Vishnu or Krishna. And this, as we've talked about before, the Bhagavat Purana really forms the basis of its own spiritual practice, and that many great sages will come together and they will hear and chant the Srimad Bhagavatam. But it's not just that you come and sit down and listen. It's like there's this rigor, there's a very serious spiritual practice that qualifies one in order to be a proper hearer and in order to be a proper speaker. It's a purely spiritual literature that's very powerful, and it has the power to elevate your consciousness into into the spiritual world. Like you can enter into transcendence simply by hearing these stories and become filled with spiritual bliss, spiritual ecstasy. But in order to access that literature, you have to be qualified. Just like if you have a jar of honey, if you want to taste the honey, you have to open the jar. I mean, you can hold the honey in your hand, you can look at it, you can even lick the glass if you want. You're not going to taste it. But if you open it, then, you immediately smell the delicious honey, wildflower honey, and you can taste it upon your tongue. And so it's the same with these transcendental stories. If you want the spiritual benefit, you have to be spiritually qualified. And so Pariksit, he represents the qualified listener, and Sukadeva Goswami represents the qualified speaker. And so what is Parikshit's qualification? Well, he's fully attentive. He knows that life is temporary. I mean, he's going to die in 7 days, and therefore he's become completely detached from the world. In fact, willingly, he's leaving it all behind, with the determination to reach spiritual perfection. And this is really the condition of all of us. We're all going to die, and it's only a matter of time. It may be after 20 years, 30 years, maybe after 40, 50, maybe after 1 day. We don't know. We're really all in his position. We could die in 7 days too. And so recognizing that the world is temporary and that death is upon us, atato brahma jigyasa, as the Vedanta Sutra says, we should focus our life fully around hearing the spiritual message and attaining spiritual perfection and developing the qualifications necessary to hear this this teachings properly, or to hear these stories and these pastimes, this philosophy, everything properly, we have to develop the qualification. So really this should be the highest priority of one's life. And this is the case with Pariksit. And he understands the temporary nature of reality. He's fully determined to attain liberation, to the extent that he's given up all eating and sleeping. He's just going to fast just so he can hear, just so he can absorb himself completely without any distraction or any mood of enjoyment. And it describes later that he becomes so filled with spiritual pleasure at hearing these topics, so filled with spiritual ecstasy, that he forgets completely his bodily needs. He's not even hungry or anything. And we can see in his interaction with Sukadeva Goswami that he's very humble, and he's very submissive, and he's very grateful, and he's very attentive, and he asks very good questions, like he wants to understand sincerely. He's very sincere. And he wants to develop his understanding, and he wants to kind of enter into the topics as deeply as possible. He's very eager. And so these are all qualifications of someone who can hear the Bhagavatam and actually enter into it, who can open the honey jar. He's also not materially absorbed. Like, you can't really open or understand these topics unless you're detached from the world, unless you're a Paramahamsa, basically, unless you're completely devoted to spiritual life and not absorbed in your own selfish gratification. It's a very high qualification, right? So it's known as the Paramahamsa Samhita. It's that literature which is meant for transcendentalists, because only they can truly enter into it and understand it and experience what it has to offer. Another thing is that he's approached a bona fide guru. Sukadeva Goswami is a bona fide teacher, and Sukadeva Goswami has heard it in a similar way. He's been a qualified listener as well and heard it from his guru. So all of this is required. You have to enter into spiritual topics through a parampara, or a disciplic succession of gurus, individuals that have heard from the proper source, and then they're simply repeating what they've heard without distorting it or changing it or sort of mixing it with illusion, just repeating the message. And they then become a qualified speaker. After being a qualified hearer, they become the next generation of qualified speakers, and in this way it comes down. And it's necessary to have this mood of submission and humility and also service. All right, all of the things are the qualification to hear the highest spiritual topics. And as we've said, Sukadeva Goswami is the proper speaker. He's also very gentle. First of all, he was the proper hearer from Vyasadeva, his father, and he has all these qualifications Pariksit has. And he's heard the message, now he's repeating it without distorting it. And he's also very gentle, and he's trying to inform. And as one reads this literature, they'll see that when questions are asked, he's very kind. He's like, thank you for this wonderful question. This is a very important question, and I can see that, you're so attentive and eager. He's congratulatory, and he's very enthusiastic to teach as well. And so in this way, he's a recognized acharya. Acharya means an individual who teaches, but he also teaches by example. He's practicing what he preaches, right? And so he's heard properly, he's imbibed it, and he's realized it, and he lives according to it. And then he's able to give that information by speaking to someone who's similarly qualified. And in this way, these spiritual teachings are passed down through time. And when one has access to such a succession, then one is qualified to be illuminated by this transcendental literature. Now there's other individuals in this assembly as well. One of those individuals is Suta Goswami, and he's actually empowered to be a teacher of the Puranas. He has an incredible memory, and he's sitting there listening along with Maharaja Pariksit, and he memorizes the entire discussion. And later on, at another holy place, in the place of Naimasaranya, which is a very sacred forest in India, it's considered the hub of the universe, or the center of the universe, and kind of like in a cosmological way. There's many great sages that come to that place, kind of at the beginning of Kali Yuga, and they begin to perform 1,000-year sacrifice. And so this obviously goes on for a very long time. But they begin this sacrifice, and it's really for the pleasure of Vishnu. And the idea is it's they're trying to benefit and influence the people of Kali Yuga, the people who will take birth in this materialistic time. So, kind of like they're performing this huge sacrifice in order to, fire sacrifice, where there's chanting and also philosophical discussions happen, things like that, in order to sort of help everyone in this materialistic age, to begin the materialistic age in a positive way. And so all these great sages are there, and Suta Goswami is there as well. And so in the midst of this assembly, this sacrifice, Shaunaka Rishi, who is kind of the head of all of these sages, he approaches Suta Goswami and he seats him very nicely and offers reverence to him and asks him, will you repeat to us everything that you've heard from Sukadeva Goswami and Pariksit, right? Can you repeat that entire conversation? So in this way, there's also a conversation in the Srimad Bhagavatam between Suta Goswami, Shaunaka Rishi, and all these sages at this sacrifice in Naimasaranya. So this is the way that many Vedic literatures are, especially the Puranas. They're nested conversations. You'll have the main conversation is Sukadeva Goswami and Maharaja Pariksit, but then you also have that conversation being relayed by Suta Goswami to these sages of Naimasaranya, and they're also asking questions, and Suta Goswami's answering them, citing that conversation on the bank of the holy river at Delhi with Maharaja Pariksit and Sukadeva Goswami. So in this way, there's even more questions and things are brought in by these sages, and these are also discussed. And even when Sukadeva Goswami is discussing with Maharaja Pariksit, he's referencing other conversations that great sages have had, in the past, and different individuals. So in this way, it's like people repeating conversations that they've heard from other people, repeating conversations they've heard. And this is how the information comes to us. And the Srimad Bhagavatam begins with questions by these sages at Naimasaranya. And they ask many important questions, such as, what is the absolute and ultimate good for people in general, especially in Kali Yuga? They're saying that now that Kali Yuga has begun, and they're performing a sacrifice to kind of push back against this materialism, but now that it's begun, they'll be short-lived. The human life will diminish. People will be, unhealthy. They'll be quarrelsome, always fighting with each other. They'll be misguided, right? Whenever they want spiritual knowledge, they'll somehow be cheated. They'll be unlucky, like all their desires very rarely will they be fulfilled. Luck is essentially, it's like your good karma, your good fortune. If you're very lucky, then your desires are fulfilled easily. If you're unlucky, then very rarely do your desires come true. The things that you want very rarely come into your hands. So the people in the age of Kali are unlucky, and above all of this, they're always disturbed, like mentally, emotionally, physically. People are very unhappy, and so can you give us? They're asking Suta Goswami, can you give us instruction, right? Like what is for the ultimate good for the people of this age, and how should they engage themselves? How can they achieve spiritual advancement? People are so disturbed and unqualified. What can they do? What should they do? And then also, can you select the essence of all the Vedas? Can you tell us what is the supreme instruction of the Vedas, and what is the ultimate good for all living beings, so that they become satisfied, so that these qualities of being disturbed and unhappy and misguided and always fighting and quarreling, what instruction of the Vedas is there that can push back on this Kali Yuga, right? That can destroy the misery and suffering caused by this age and the illusion caused by this age. What do the Vedas have to offer to actually push back against it and cause it to disintegrate? Right? What light from the Vedas can shine into this world and be powerful enough to blast away the darkness? And we see that this is what prompts Suta Goswami to speak the Srimad Bhagavatam, because it is that essence of the Vedas. It's that highest teaching of the Vedas, namely the activities of the personality of God. The activities of God, and especially the avatars as they descend in the world. The reason that the Supreme Lord enters the world as avatars is in order to sort of reveal himself to us and reveal his personality and his qualities and to reveal his names and to give us something to talk about that's completely spiritual, something to absorb our mind and consciousness in. And it's extremely purifying. And this is really the highest revelation of the Vedas, is who is God and what does he look like, what are his activities, details about his personality and the things he's done and his interactions with those who are devoted to him. And it's kind of like God's name, his address, his phone number, great detail about God. And this is the highest thing that the Vedas have to offer. And so it's so powerful and so purifying that even in the time of the grossest materialistic darkness, it has the power to destroy all of the vice and the sin and the misery and the suffering of this particular age. So these topics are extremely purifying, and especially the sages mentioned the holy name. If you chant the name of Vishnu, the Hare Krishna, or Om Namo Narayana, these various names of God are extremely powerful, and they can blast away and deliver people from the miserable condition of the age of Kali. And this is mentioned other places within the Vedic literature as well, like the Kali Santadana Upanishad, Harirnam Eva Kevalam. There's many different verses which describe the potency or the power of the name of God as the source of deliverance during this particular time. And they also ask now that Krishna, this kind of the last avatar at the time, the one that had just left, now that he's left and this kind of Kali Yuga has begun, where have religious principles gone for shelter? Like now, where does Dharma reside? Where does religion reside? Where can you find religion in the age of Kali? And Suta Goswami answers that it's in the Srimad Bhagavatam itself. It becomes like a repository of transcendental wisdom in this dark age. And it persists, whereas it's interesting that you see that the Vedas, as we've discussed before, they've practically vanished. Even 5,000 years into Kali Yuga, only a small portion of them exist. And yet the Bhagavat Purana grows stronger and stronger. Like it, not only does it exist, but it's the most prominent of all the Puranas. And the practice of bhakti yoga, or the practice of devotion that is centered around the Bhagavatam, more and more it becomes the most prominent part of the Vedas. So it's almost like as the sun sets on spirituality and Dharma, the light of the Bhagavatam rises, and it becomes the light within the age of Kali. As we said, it's centered around the remembrance of the activities of Vishnu and his name and his qualities, etc. And so after answering these questions in a preliminary way and establishing especially the transcendental position of Vishnu, the Srimad Bhagavatam begins. So much of the beginning of the Bhagavatam is a philosophical discourse that talks about the avatars, and it talks ultimately about how God is transcendental to matter. He's not within matter. It kind of establishes his exalted position, and therefore when you hear the activities, you can get the spiritual benefit. If you're listening to the activities of the avatars and yet you think God is merely matter, or you think that he's material, or you think he's just a demigod, then you can't really enter into that honey jar, right? In order to open the honey jar and actually lick and taste the honey, you have to have a certain attitude and consciousness. Otherwise, you're just licking the outside of the honey jar, and you never really taste it. As we mentioned before, you can hold it in your hand, you can feel it, and there's no taste. You can't even smell anything, what to speak of taste anything. So in order to enter and open the honey jar, one of the primary things must be you understand who Vishnu or Krishna is. You understand the position of the Supreme Lord, his exalted position, and your position in relationship to him. You have to give up you have to take a submissive position, and you have to recognize that he's transcendental to matter and that he's omnipotent and all-powerful. And then when you hear the stories of the avatars, then it can take effect. Like you have the proper attitude to receive it. You're open to that spiritual light. And as we've discussed before, these different stories of Maharaja Pariksit and Vyasadeva and Sukadeva Goswami and Narada Muni, all of these things take place in the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and also discussing the activities immediately happening after the Battle of Kurukshetra, after the Mahabharata ends. And there's many things that happen which we haven't discussed, which are there in the Bhagavatam. So the first two cantos, the Srimad Bhagavatam has 12 cantos. It's a very large book, thousands upon thousands of verses, and they're divided up into 12 cantos, which are sort of like books in themselves. And so there's a certain process to studying the Srimad Bhagavatam, that it begins by studying the first canto, then the second canto, then the third canto, fourth canto, and you move your way up through the cantos, because there's a gradual revelation and elevation of consciousness, so that you become more and more purified to understand the stories of the avatars. And then finally, as you get into the higher cantos, like the 10th canto, the 11th canto, then the highest revelation of the activities of God are given. The most intimate stories are given, and the most deep presentation of the qualities and the activities of God, of His personality, basically, of who He is and what He's like. All of that stuff is given in the higher levels of the Bhagavatam, because by that time you've studied and you're actually you have the proper attitude to understand that and draw benefit from it. In fact, it's advised that you not jump forward into the higher levels of the Bhagavatam, because you can simply develop an offensive mindset, because you don't have the proper sort of qualification. Just like if you're studying mathematics or something, if you have to study algebra, and you have to study calculus and these different things. First you have to have like basic fundamental math, ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, and then finally you make your way in high school to algebra and calculus, and then you have to get all of that stuff clearly understood before you enter into high-level physics classes and high-level mathematics, quantum mechanics, and things like that. And if you don't have those basic fundamental principles of math understood, you're just going to make huge mistakes. It'll be incomprehensible to you, and you'll draw all the wrong conclusions. So similarly, you have to start with the basic literatures and then move your way into deeper and deeper revelations of God and more intimate understandings of His personality. In fact, it's described, the Bhagavatam itself, as like a deity or an image, you'll find in a temple, like the statue in the temple. And the traditional way of approaching these statues is that you look at their feet, and then you look at their knees and upwards their hips and their chest, and you gradually make your way towards the face, which is where most of the personality is exhibited. So it's the same with the Srimad Bhagavatam, that you begin with the first and second canto are like the feet, and then the third, the fourth, the fifth, you're sort of moving your way up the deity, and then the 10th canto is the shining face of the deity, and that's where the pastimes of Krishna in Vrindavan are discussed in depth. And so, as you've mentioned before, you have the Vedic literature, which is used primarily in sacrifice. It's prayer to the gods, etc., and various rules about how to perform these rituals. And there's an entire culture which is based upon purification and spiritual elevation and study that is really working tandem with this particular body of literature. And then within this literature you have the Upanishads, which are that aspect of the Vedas which talks about Brahman, or transcendence, what is the absolute truth. And you have the Vedanta Sutra, which is a compilation or commentary on these Upanishads by the author Vyasadeva, and discussing basically the various philosophies within the Vedic literature and presenting the absolute truth in a very clear way. It's really the essence of the Vedas. It's the end of the Vedas. That's what Vedanta means. It's the end of all knowledge. And so it is spiritual knowledge. The purpose of life is self-realization and the attainment of liberation and ultimately love of God. And so all these things are discussed in the Vedanta Sutra, and then that commentary or that exposition on the Vedanta Sutra and on what the absolute truth is, that is then the Bhagavat Purana. And then within the Bhagavat Purana, which describes the personality of God, there's different levels of Brahman. There's the Brahman, which is the transcendental light of bliss, which is all-pervading, and the soul is a spark of that light. And then there's the presence of God within the heart as Parabrahman or Paramatma, sort of like the localized aspect of the absolute truth which accompanies the soul and the sojourn of birth and death. And then finally you have the source of everything. You have the source of that light of Brahman. The light of Brahman is merely the bodily effulgence of God. In fact, this is the understanding in Catholicism as well. It's called the magnificent beatitude. It's the light that emanates from God or emanates from the spiritual realm. And we're all existing within that light in the material world, is also floating within that light, and yet it's covered by the various elements of material existence, time and karma, as well as nature itself, material nature, earth, air, fire, water. And the souls, although by nature spiritual, are entangled within these material elements. And through processes of yoga, one can raise one's consciousness to transcend this material existence and to realize Brahman. And this is really central to the Vedas. And then one can go even higher to meditate upon the Supersoul, or the Paramatma within the heart. And then finally one can come to the very source of Brahman, which is God. And so that aspect of the Vedic literature, the very essence of the Vedic literature, the Bhagavatam, is really a presentation of who God is in a very intimate way. What is his personality? What are his activities? What is his name? What is he like? What does he do? And really it introduces you to God as a person. And so this very essence of Vedic literatures, it culminates in the 10th canto, which is the presentation of Krishna, who's the original personality of God. It's kind of like God in his most intimate form, and talks about his activities in Vrindavan and in Dwarka and Mathura and many other places, and really presents God in the most beautiful form that can be understood. And it presents him in a way which is extremely attractive. And you'll see that much of the literature within India and the music and the drama and all of these things, they emphasize the personality of God, such as Krishna, or they emphasize Rama. And in this way, the culture of India is kind of steeped in this highest aspect of the Vedic literature. But one cannot simply enter into looking at this smiling face of God, in a haphazard way. You have to really develop the qualification to understand and appreciate and to see that beauty. It's just like, if you have somebody who, sometimes you see these videos on YouTube of like somebody who hears for the first time, like they have these implants that are put into people's heads and allow them to hear, and they've gone through their whole life without hearing, and they don't know what their husband or their wife, they don't know what their voice is like, and they don't know what their mother's voice is like or their father's voice. And yet by this implant technology, the technician is able to sort of turn up the volume, and then they can hear, and immediately they become overwhelmed with emotion, like it's like a revelation. Their whole life has changed. And so it's the same thing with the Vedic literature. It's like God is a person, and you have a relationship with him, but we're unable to hear it. We're unable to see it. We're unable to experience it because we're in a state of being like spiritually deaf. It's kind of like our illusion about what reality is, and our illusion about the nature of material existence in which we're in, the kind of thickness of that illusion, that darkness, which blocks the true nature of the spirit soul from shining out, is kind of like being deaf. But by entering into the process of learning and understanding through the Vedas, it's like that technician turning the volume up and up and up and up, almost like you have these light switches, these kind of round ones that you turn the switch and gradually the light raises and raises and raises. So studying the Vedic literatures is like that. If one hears from a proper source, if one enters into learning the Vedas through a proper disciplic succession of guru and disciple, then the power of the Vedas is there, and that light gradually raises and raises until you can see properly. Or the volume of our hearing, our deafness gradually diminishes until we can hear the personality behind the universe, our highest mother, our highest father, and hearing their voice for the first time. And then there's that revelation. You actually see the person, you hear the person, you experience that individual. And it is really the same with the Srimad Bhagavatam, in that you can hear the Srimad Bhagavatam, but if you're not personally qualified, if you haven't gone through the process of purification, it's falling on deaf ears. It just sounds like any other vibration. But if you go through the process of purification, then you actually truly hear, you actually truly see, and you truly experience God. Like the Bhagavatam is not just a regular book. It reminds me of that, if you remember that movie, Never Ending Story, right? Where this boy, he has this book, but it's not like any other book. As by studying the book, you actually enter into the book. and you interact with the book. It's a living thing. So that's what the Bhagavat Purana is. It's not a regular book. It is a manifestation of God's power. And by studying it and entering into it, having gone through the proper process of training and education and purification and qualified yourself, then it turns into a very real experience of the personality of God. And so, as we mentioned, mathematics, it doesn't begin on quantum physics. It doesn't even begin with algebra and calculus. It begins with the ABCs. And really within the Vedic literature, the ABCs are the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is the Bible of India. It's kind of like the fundamental text of the Vedic literature. So in our next podcast, we'll talk about the Bhagavad Gita and kind of give a sort of broad background or perspective on what it is. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.